But then, of course, my aunt Louise, she was the one that always saw that her brothers and sisters. My mother was one of a family of 10. Always went to church at St. John's. But in later years, she never went. And I would just walk to Renner Olds when I was on 68th, and I would walk down the street and I'd visit with her. And she would always have her coffee and her cigarettes, and that's what eventually killed her, was smoking cigarettes. And we'd always have discussions, and then she'd say, take this away, take it home and read it. With the Book of Mormon, she had the Apocrypha, all of this stuff that never made it into the Bible, and some of it is really bizarre. You know, when Jesus walks to Pontius Pilate, the flagstaffs bow to him. I mean, he wasn't there.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Vince Prantil. I'm over here. I am a professor of engineering at Milwaukee School of Engineering. And when we were at Mount Zion previously to coming here to St. Matt's, and I think it must have been close to about 8 years ago, I gave a series of adult eds. It was 2 weeks in a row on science or faith, science and faith, and I will preface this. This is the grand, are you Fox or MSNBC argument. There's parentheses very farly divided on the left and the right. This has a lot of analogs to what I tell people are probably are very partisan in politics these days. It's almost as if you sit in the middle, you don't have a conviction. I want to say that I really believe, I'm going to preface this with the fact that that's not true. But as is often the case in these kind of discussions, people at the left end and the right end are very, very vocal. And so we have our Fox, MSNBC kind of split, and people are calling people toward one of the parentheses in this discussion, but it's really a continuum. I want to point that I didn't get a chance to put this in the presentation, but there was a great op-ed article in the Sunday New York Times in July of this year, saying where reason ends and faith begins. So you see this is a nice little clip I took off the internet, but I have to tell you, I had a studies advisor in graduate school who found out there was a new journal of rational mechanics. And he always took offense at that, saying, what do the rest of us do? Irrational mechanics? So when you see faith and reason, is faith unreasonable? Absolutely not. But people like to associate the name reason with science for very strict definition of words kind of meaning. It doesn't mean that faith is unreasonable. But where does reason end and faith begin? And I want to read a little quote out of here because it's kind of a preface of what we're going to talk about. William James, Nobel laureate and Fellows of the Royal Society, said that he introduced the concept of a boggle threshold, the level above which the mind boggles when faced with some new fact or report or idea. And one of the other scientists in the Royal Society said she was fine with telepathy, but hesitant about reincarnation and absolutely appalled that a woman who was her colleague had flown across the Atlantic to have her torn aura repaired by a guru. So here's a person who's scientific, whose colleague is very scientific, but had her aura disturbed and had to have it repaired. And she's appalled by that because she lives on that scientific end of the spectrum. We all have boggle thresholds. We all have boggle lines. Praying in an ancient language you don't understand? Fine. Praying in tongues not of a human language is an anathema. A God who has a human son who allows himself to be killed? That's natural. A God with 8 arms and a lusty sexual appetite? That's weird. You believe in the Holy Spirit, but you draw a line at exorcism. You take for granted that Christ will come again to earth, but riding on a white horse and wearing a robe dipped in blood? Obviously, fantasy. Now, if you hear those words, you'll hear anathema, appalled, obviously. This is part of the discussion. Part of the reason some of this lends people to have very strong feelings either way is people at the extremes of the discussion use very strong language. This is not something that we're surprised about in politics, and it maybe is not surprising that there's a very good analogy here. People at both ends of the spectrum can use quite strong language, and there is a middle ground. And first of all, I will not answer this question of and or. I'm in the and camp, obviously, or I might not be here, or I might not be teaching. I might not have my day job and my Sunday leanings if I didn't live in the middle. But I want to tell you something about people that live at either end, and I'm not obviously going to tell the whole story, and I'm not going to answer the question, and there's a lot of things I'm not going to do, and we can't do if we're honest, but that goes partly toward offending someone who's at either end of the spectrum who thinks that the answers have been had. But I would like to entertain the idea that there are places to stand in the middle. because I happen to have a Boggle threshold, just like everyone here, okay? So the issue is God versus science isn't the issue. Versus is a very strong word, okay? Versus is either A or B. And I'm going to have something to say about that here in maybe a moment or a few moments. I'll pose a question, much like a premise that you'll hear in a TED Talk. I just thought TED Talks are really, really great because the author of a TED Talk is supposed to have a premise and then supposed to have some quasi arrow toward what they would like you to think as part of the answer of the premise. Okay? So here's an issue that says, it isn't the issue about choosing God or science. We talk about the clash between, again, strong language, clash between God and science. In practice, it often comes down to disagreements about man and morals. I will also preface this with the fact that Pastor Matt gave a very moving discussion of science and faith to the confirmation students 2 weeks ago on Wednesday. And he had the whole history from the ancient philosophers to the present about where people have stood on this spectrum. I think I will talk only a few of those issues, and I would invite people to consider asking Pastor Matt. He may talk about this in some of what is his upcoming talk, What is Truth? And talk about some of the philosophers from the very beginning that sat on either side. And again, Descartes came to the conclusion that it was mind and matter. Mind, which we associate with the soul, matter, which we associate with scientific dealings and more of a certainty versus doubt. That's a whole different discussion, certainty versus doubt. It has relationship here, but it's not this discussion. Mind versus morals has everything to do with this discussion, but it kind of takes us off some of the mark of where we want to be in the middle. So this isn't the issue. This issue is important, but it's not. Pastor Steve at Reformation once gave a sermon where he talked for 10 minutes and he goes, but that's not my sermon. And he went on for another 2 minutes, he goes, but that's not my sermon. And at the end, he came back and said it was all his sermon, which was a real neat way to tie it up. And I kind of hope this has an essence, a little essence of that, but a couple times I'm probably going to say, well, that's not what I'm here to talk about. Okay. Science, great as it is, can't answer every question. Oh my gosh, I hope there's scientists who believe that. If you don't believe that, then you stop investigating, you stop discovering, you stop being curious. Being curious and doubting is the driver for science. Being curious and doubting and being curious is sometimes a driver in faith, okay? And so it says, though evolution may explain the process by which life evolves, it doesn't explain how or why the process began. This is a huge, huge discussion. People at the scientific end of the spectrum, and I'll talk about Richard Dawkins a lot probably because he chafes me, which is kind of good. People that chafe you are kind of good, they get you to think. But he says there's no reason, absolutely ludicrous and ridiculous, and those are strong words, to ask why the universe exists. That it exists? No, and how it came into being, and he always talks about how it came into being from the Big Bang, something small. Something almost imperceptibly small. And the quantum mechanics explains how we can have something from nothing. Well, if one wants to believe in the limit of zero probability as there being no chance for something happens, God knows that there are different levels of infinity. Different levels. 1 over infinity is 0, and there are different levels of infinity, and sometimes science has to struggle with that. And when scientists speak to a lay audience, they're not always apt to explain that end of the left-hand side parenthesis. I'll give an example of that conflict questions in a moment, okay? Now, again, this is rather strong. I'm not here to talk about atheism or agnosticism. People have reasons for wanting to be in this camp that has nothing to do with science. But scientists who believe science trumps faith are usually, and in Dawkins' sense, in that left-hand side of the parenthesis, there is no need for God. Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss, now Stephen Hawking has joined the group. The fact that we don't need God to exist because we can explain everything with science. Creationism is not the only camp on the right, but it's one where faith generally trumps science. I'm going to tell you, just because I'm the one putting slides up here, and I did choose which slides to put in and which to cut out, but I am in the intelligent design camp, just so you know that as background. I look at it as living with biologos, science and faith being in harmony. These are middle grounds between the extremes. Oftentimes, one either end of the spectrum are described, and I'll come back to this also in a minute, Scientific domain is one where we rigorously apply the scientific method. We rationally evaluate theories and observations. Everything comes from observation. Carefully planned experiments are about observing things. Questions, how did life come to be, are absolutely rational and reasonable and okay to ask and answer. These are what Pastor Matt calls what questions. He gave a box to the confirmation kids, and in one room, half the kids had to say what was in the box. They were allowed to shake it, they were allowed to smell it, they were allowed to hear it, they were allowed to apply principles that a baby in a crib would apply. When Lorna and I had Carmen, we went to a talk at Berkeley by a woman who wrote a book called The Scientist in the Crib. Every baby is a scientist that does experiments with the world around it, okay? And the baby had not yet developed morals, although I'm not so sure we all know about this, but we do know that we can see the scientist in the crib shaking the box and licking the box and trying to figure out what's in the box. The other half of the confirmation kids were put in a room and said, for what purpose was the thing inside this box placed there? And they were asked all purpose questions. What is the reason for the universe? Now Dawkins at the scientific end of the spectrum will say it's absolutely ludicrous and ridiculous to ask such a question because there's no way to answer it. Okay, so in the spiritual domain, there are people that ask those kind of questions. They use the heart, the mind, and the soul to answer questions. I won't explain exactly that, there is no scientific method for the heart and the mind and the soul. It's not possible to explore things, and Barbara Brown Taylor said this. There is no equation for the matters of the soul. There is no equation that explains God and why our belief in God is what it is. Why did life, come to be? What comes after life? What is the meaning of life? These are purpose questions, and in the extreme scientific point of view, there's no place for these kinds of questions. But humans, one can argue about this, and I'll present something in a minute just about the right brain, left brain kind of thinking. Humans, this is very left-brained activity. This is very right-brained sort of activity if you map the brain. But we are characterized by a deep-seated longing for truth. We sometimes reject scientific evidence, and that leads us to new kinds of paradigm shifts in science. And some of us on the scientific end can, and I would claim do, exhibit shallow spirituality or actual apathy. But that's for very strong reasons people feel very principled about. Where some of this comes from is that humans are dual lobe-minded. Humans are two sides of a brain. The left brain is logical, analytical, objective, all things reasoning, numerically structured. It's based on what I can see, what I can taste, what I can feel, like the baby licking the box. In discussions in the British Royal Society, these would be called discussions of matter and intellect. The right brain. Right brain is that side of you that makes decisions almost subconsciously. It sees something in a painting, in a Rorschach drawing. It's abstract, it's intuitive. There are many theories that claim when babies are born, they are not a blank slate. The woman who wrote Scientist in the Crib said babies are not a blank slate, that it's nature nurture, but you come impregnated with a certain kind of humanity that scientists know to a certain extent, but they can't really explain necessarily. It's usually no longer than 45 seconds before a baby is born that they naturally smile and react to another human face. Okay, I'm not going to say there's no scientific explanation for that, but there is evidence like that, scientific, that babies don't come as a complete empty slate. There are students that struggle in school because they are very right-brained. I just finished writing a book where there's a professor at University of Maryland who was educated at Cornell, and he said, the problem is we teach this math to people, and the right-brained way of thinking is very natural. The abstract way of extracting this information is very natural, but we teach it with equations. We teach it with all left-brain ways of reaching people, and they're not the same ways to reach right-brained thinking individuals. So people who are creative, artistic, musical, spiritual, emotional, that's not always in the 3 R's in school. It can be. Engineers can be creative, and musicians can learn music theory. And we're going to say something later on about the golden section and the golden ratio. It actually relates octaves in music. There's beauty to something because there's a number behind it, and I shouldn't have used the word because. To me, as a scientist, more of a science-leaning person, that is an explanation. To a musician, that might be sacrilege. Okay? The lobes are not separated. My sister still suffers from an issue where she could suddenly black out, and it was because the two sides of her brain talked too much. We have also many mental illnesses where the two sides of the brain don't talk at all. And there's many interesting experiments to show someone looking at an elephant who can stomp and make the sound of an elephant but can't say the word. Language is in the left side of the brain. Music is in the right side of the brain. When people have a stroke, Lorna's grandmother suffered from a stroke but could sing. Musical therapy is something to do in the first 48 hours and thereafter, people who've suffered brain damage from a stroke. My sister had an instance where her two sides of her brain talk too much, so she has a neurotransmitter inhibitor that she takes as a medicine that cuts her brains from talking too much to each other, so they talk the right amount. Okay, interesting, but brain function is dichotomous in the sense that this is the left, this is the right. We find things over here we don't find here, but our function of the brain altogether is not as two-lobed and dichotomous as one thought, because the two sides talk to each other. This is something scientists and people, when Richard Dawkins debated the archbishop in England, well, there was a discourse, but it was a he said, she said kind of discourse, you know, and these sides of the brain work in harmony. And the idea is if you try to work in harmony, good things can happen. There's many bad things can happen when the brain, two sides of the brain talk too much or not enough, okay? Math uses, in fact, both sides for different purposes. So the right brain, left brain functional dominance, I say it's more myth than science. It's not, myth is too strong a word perhaps, but the idea is like anything else, it's both things. And I think now would be a good time for the other slide, but I don't have it right here. So in a minute I'm going to talk about looking at both things rather than either or. Parker Palmer talked about that. He said in our culture, both in the United States and in the Western world, we have a lot of either or thinking versus both and thinking. Last time I was here, I asked you to consider that he had also spoken, in the words of Henry Nouwen, that we have too much thinking from scarcity, always saving money for a rainy day. But people who think from abundance give freely from what they have, and it always comes back. When you have 5 loaves and 2 fish and you try to feed everybody, suddenly more food appears. Chris Capper can tell you the very same thing. Okay? So here, we won't go into all of this, but if you live on the science end of the parenthesis, okay, atheism might be the strong form, agnosticism somewhat the weak form, but often you ardently do not ascribe to any potential. That's the weird thing. You don't often ascribe to the potential even for synthesis and harmony between these two things. They are black and white. Okay? To scientists, science and religion, at the far left end of the spectrum where if you live mostly scientific, things are black and white, and you may be black, and the archbishop may be white. And sometimes the people ardently of a faith community that argue only against the fact that science doesn't have all the answers, perhaps. They see the world as more white and true, there's a lot of gray. Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist, but I like his quotes only because they're so distasteful to me. in that kind of way, when you want to spar with your enemy, students still say that the best lecture ever in 15 years in my class in numerical methods was when I was walking through the lounge and I told one of my arch enemies in terms of, but this is in the great partisan era of Congress where your arch enemy was there and you said, hey, come upstairs, I'm going to trash computational fluid dynamics. And he picked up his book, something I totally didn't expect him to do, and came to the room. And there was a lectern at one end which he knows I disdain. I pushed the lectern. He got another lectern out of another classroom, and we sat there and debated. I debated the solid side of the story, he debated the fluid side of the story. We had no lecture notes. We just had between us 40 years experience in the field, and I go, oh, he'll tell you that, but listen why you shouldn't listen to him. And we actually did the Fox NBC thing. Students still say that was the best lecture, not that he ever gave it, that I ever gave it. That's because I gave half of it up to somebody else. But here's Dawkins. So you should understand, Dawkins does have the willingness to he often goes around with Lawrence Krauss, and they're two like-minded people, and nothing wrong with that, but he'll often debate archbishops, so that's good too. Evolution fully accounts for the observed biological complexity and origin of humankind, so there is no need for God. This is not stepping on feet here, right? Faith is a great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Being belief that is not based on evidence is the principal vice of every religion. Well, give him this. He believes in his principledness. He absolutely believes it. Very much like someone who absolutely believes cars evolved out of fish. They came up, they shed their fins, and grew wheels. I mean, if you want to believe that, fine. And then you show evidence for it. Now, showing evidence that God doesn't exist is something he's devoted to 3 books. So I definitely believe he believes it. But maybe this is a good place to Now, this isn't the best clip of him, but it's the shortest one I could find, and so we have to live with that. I hope it works.
I think what these two men are doing out there, promoting
Dawkins.
a scientific worldview, is something of great value.
But my 200 million great-grandfather was a fish. It's part of human nature to want to ask the question why, in the sense of purpose. It may very well be part of human nature, but that doesn't make it a valid question. There are all sorts of questions which you can ask. What's funny about that? What is funny about that?
What do you see when you look in the mirror?
I see myself, no, cut the cut. It is very mysterious how the universe came into being. It's a deeply mysterious and interesting question.
One of the most amazing realizations of the 20th century was that quantum mechanics, combined with relativity, allows something to come from nothing.
Don't you think this is completely ludicrous?
Yes, it's probably nonsense.
Why is incest wrong? It's not clear to me that it's wrong. Okay. It's clear to me there's never been
What a disgusting idea. You can dispute exactly what's meant by nothing, but whatever it is, it's very, very simple. And why is that funny?
Well, I think it's a bit funny to be trying to define nothing.
And this is wherein an archbishop has trouble with Dawkins, is that Dawkins says he has very clear, lucid explanations from a well-read scientist's point of view about how things could have all evolved from the Big Bang, but of course he doesn't have an answer to what happened at t equals 0 minus, right before the Big Bang. Darwin, he's very careful to explain, can tell us everything about what happened from life being very simple. But there, when he said his explanation was simple, he didn't mean the explanation of nothing was simple-minded. He meant, I can say how the universe evolved, all of us, any of us can, from a simple beginning. What the Archbishop was saying was something almost entirely different. You can't explain how it comes from nothing. Now, Krauss believes that with quantum mechanics, if you can actually say in quantum mechanics, there's a probability that the particle's here, there's a probability that the particle isn't here at all. Well, there is a probability that the particle wasn't there at t equals 0 at the Big Bang, but that doesn't, in a faith person's eye, that's just a probability. God is the master of probability, and that doesn't mean you started from nothing. But this is a very, very philosophical argument at this point. Nobody wins that argument. It's just a matter of which camp you're in, okay? So this camp thinks science trumps faith, is one where faith trumps science, and I'll just say that's creationism. And Pastor Matt or Dan Bice would be a much better person to list all the references about creationism. But here's the thing, climate change doesn't occur. The second law of thermodynamics rules out the possibility of evolution. Well, I understand a little bit about the second law, and I understand a little bit about evolution, and there is a fault in this argument, okay? Now, this is a premise that I will throw out there. It's a reality, whether people want to buy it or not. Only people at the extremes don't buy this reality. Anyone in the middle will be able to spot this reality if they think about it long enough. There are claims at the extremes that oftentimes use a faulty argument. Okay, so let me just say we've experienced things like Henry Morris. When science and the Bible differ, science obviously has misinterpreted its data. Well, again, obviously, almost no quote from these right and left-hand parenthesis camps comes without some kind of strong language, because they need strong language. They quite definitely need strong language to stand on these ends. This is an interesting thing that was true about 8 years ago. Views held by approximately 45% of all Americans. I don't find that scary. I just find that to be a reality we ought to be aware of. There's a lot of people in a strong creationist camp. Now, intelligent design was originally, whatever you want to call it, founded by Philip Johnson, a lawyer at Berkeley. Evolution promotes atheism, so it must be resisted, is what the thought was among some people, as opposed to it requires. Some people actually believe that there is. I'm in the intelligent design camp, but let me split it into two. I can see how complexity begets someone to think there is a designer. The premise of intelligent design is any kind of complex design leads you to naturally believe there's a designer. If you walk on the beach and you find sand, well, you say sand has a purpose for being on the beach, but the old argument is called the watchmaker. God is the watchmaker. If you're walking on a beach and you find a very exquisite watch with very interesting mechanisms inside, well, it didn't just show up there. this design begets the fact that there must have been a designer who designed it for an express purpose or family of purposes. Okay, so the design begets the need for a designer. Some people believe that it's absolutely necessary to have the designer. That's the strong religious side of intelligent design. Others simply say, and I'm in this camp, I'm just fascinated that any of this could have happened by chance. Or any of it could simply, that someone could devise a set of laws so intricate that all of this would arise and you wouldn't ever be tempted to ask why. And I'll give an example of that in a minute. So, intelligent design works, and humans evolve, and then shells and plant leaves and human bodies evolve in exactly a similar manner in terms of their shape ratios. I'm sitting here saying, how? How can that possibly come from an equation? Who is a mastermind of the equation that it works in all these fields, okay? So, also, where science, this is something where science needs divine help, I would claim there's a weaker side, and I'm in that quote-unquote weaker side that says science has no trouble admitting divine help. Science admits the existence of a God that doesn't conflict with any of the scientific evidence. A lot of strong people who live in this camp, and they say it was the religious side of the camp, its side of the parenthesis. Give us some credit here. Its side of the parenthesis moved and said, okay, I believe in evolution. I see the evidence for evolution, but it was the masterful language of an omnipotent being. Francis Collins, who wrote The Language of God, he's the cracker, admittedly the head of the project that cracked the human genome. He believes all of DNA and all of the human genome is the language of God. Fascinating. Now, there's also other aspects of the weak side of intelligent design. Now here, it's interesting. Higgs boson, he actually termed the phrase the God particle, and then said later, as oftentimes people are apt to do, I'm sorry that I did that. And for this particular reason, they said, well, it created a new paradigm. That's another thing I'm going to talk about with science. There are these paradigm shifts. Newton's right all the way up until Einstein shows up. Okay? Einstein's right.
Believed in God.
Huh?
And Einstein believed in
And
God.
Einstein, we're going to see that. Einstein absolutely believed in God. Richard Dawkins believes in all those things Einstein believed in, but absolutely, this is anathema to him that God exists. Okay? So here, he's just afraid of this because it got thrown in that discussion. He threw his ping pong ball at a machine that was madly throwing them back and forth, and he's, oh gosh, what did I do? I didn't mean to enter that room. Okay? And he did that by naming his particle the God particle. Okay. Science and faith coexist. We'll have many examples of this. Francis Collins, is God not the greatest scientist, the greatest biologist, the greatest mathematician? Isn't deciphering the human genome a stunning scientific achievement and an occasion of worship? I can't get enough of reading this person. Okay? Galileo, I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended for us to forego their use. Just like, there's a great quote from Einstein coming up. He says, yes, I believe in evolution and I believe in stupidity, but human stupidity, I just don't know which I believe in more. So, you know, there's a sort of humility that comes with living in the middle, I believe. Dalai Lama views Buddhism and science as complementary. It's not the first time he's been ahead of the mark and told Tibetan Buddhists to consider the fact that science has a lot to tell us. So here's the TED Talk kind of premise. What might be a way to embrace science or faith, or science and faith? And I think let's considering paradigms. Okay? The agility of both and thinking versus either or thinking. Right hand, left hand parenthesis are very much either or thinking. You're with us or you're against us. Okay? And there's so much evidence in your camp, you believe, that to be on the other side just doesn't make a lot of sense. That you're not throwing away evidence you should throw away. And one of the other quotes on here was just that way. Obviously, science has misinterpreted as data. There's no room for that. There's no room in either or thinking for both and thinking. Okay? So this is a way to enter the room and somehow try to stay in the middle of the fray of the balls bouncing back and forth. Now, people who espouse either or thinking are very apt to tell you there are contradictions. They're very apt to point out in the Bible says A and the Bible says B, and those are utter contradictions. Parker Palmer then said if you step back and see these, you can oftentimes see them as paradox. If you're a little more differently minded, I want to say more open-minded about it. God has a female and a male nature. The disciples were all male, priests should all be male. You can see these things bantered back and forth. But the Rabbi Harold Kushner has written a book, How Good Do We Have to Be, with an eloquent explanation of the Hebrew word from rib, Adam's rib, also meaning side. That man, and Pastor Matt talked about this, man didn't actually exist. Adam was mud. The Hebrew word meant mud. It wasn't man. He didn't become man until woman came from him. These being two sides of God. It's an unusual but really appealing interpretation of Genesis. Okay? But either or thinking is, again, the creationist. Either you're with the creationist or you're with the evolutionist. Gender has no crossover. There's male or female. It's either or, but you can't be both. There's no gray area. Okay, in paradox, I don't know if it would be nice if this were the place, and it's not, of course. There's so many places this stuff intersects. So I'm gonna jump ahead real quick. No, I won't. Never mind. There's an old Saturday Night Live skit, so I'll skip that slide when I get it, where Chevy Chase comes in, and Gilda Radner's here, and Dan Aykroyd's here, and Dan Aykroyd's eating his dessert, and she's washing the floor, and he's just put this whipped cream on his dessert, and she puts it on the mop. And she goes, "What are you doing?" And he goes, "It's shimmer. It's a dessert topping." She goes, "It's a floor wax." And it's dessert topping, floor wax. They start fighting. Chevy Chase comes in and goes, "Quiet, you two. It's both. New shimmer, non-dairy floor wax is a dessert topping and a floor wax." And then they go on to use it. And like all comedy, it presents some kind of parody of a contradiction. And then you're led to laugh because of how absurd this is. How absurd that it can be. And this is how strongly Richard Dawkins did. It's absurd that it could be a floor wax and a dessert topping. I want to give just a couple little examples. They're not little, by the way. They're little because somebody really wise explained them in a way that at least should give you pause about why relativity says that the world was created in 13.8 billion years, but that's also 6 24-hour days. And how scientists embrace this kind of paradox. That's a paradox. Relativity has a thing called the twin paradox. We'll talk about in a minute. So the idea is, can we embrace both and thinking? Pastor Matt would tell you that Dawkins is a materialist naturalist. Science has all the answers. Krauss, Gould, Stephen Jay Gould, Hawking. These are literalists in the scientific end that use the scientific method, natural observation, as the rule book. Creationists have a very strong, maybe 24, I call it 24/6, 24-hour day ideology. Evolution refutes the creation story. There are young earth creationists that kind of live in the middle, a little bit more toward the right end, and the literal interpretation is the Bible is the rule book, okay? And again, if you're on one end, you like to talk about contradictions, and there can be either or thinking that's reasonable and maybe not reasonable, okay? No one can serve two masters. Either you hate one and love the other, or you be devoted to one and despise the other. When you think about it, it's not just true of God and money. It's true about science and faith. People will tell you, you must pick. Get in the car, that car or this car. There is no car in between. Okay? So at the extreme ends, you'll hear this kind of argument. This is an article that just appeared yesterday. It says, under Pope Francis, the church is struggling to figure out who belongs. And it's talking about family. Talking about family and whether we allow divorced Catholics without marriage being a no. But the interesting people, they start out strongly. We must not forget that the church that preaches about family is a sign of contradiction, because the pastors don't live in an integral type of a family the way the rest of us do, and as they do in Protestant denominations, okay? So when you have a glaring contradiction, it makes it hard to have the conversation. You have to constantly revisit it. So there is, in my mind, a negative thing to being so associated with one parenthesis, but it's a reality, okay? Here's what the Dawkins of the world would say. Can God create a rock so big that even God can't lift it? There's your apparent contradiction that should lead you to understand your God isn't everything you say your God is. Okay? But now when you see an argument like this, can you answer the question? Jesus wouldn't fall for a question like this. This is what I oftentimes wish. I wish I had that chapter where Jesus is asked this question by the Pharisees, because he would not give it an answer. Because either answer, you what? You lose. You lose with the answer. So the question is phrased in a way, it's the no-win situation. So what happened in the first remake Star Trek movie? Captain Kirk was the only one who survived the Kobayashi Maru syndrome, the no-win situation. And they said, how did he have the young cadets says, how did he do it? And Spock says, he reprogrammed the computer. She goes, he cheated. And he goes, no, he doesn't believe in the no-win situation. He's the only cadet to ever do that. Jesus is the only cadet not to fall for these kind of questions. Okay? Because he doesn't believe that the either-or answer here works. There's a both-and answer. And where this comes from is God can create a rock so big because God is infinitely able to create anything as big as God wants to. And God can lift the thing that even God can build because these are two levels of infinity. In the science world, if you have infinity and infinity squared is infinity, but it's a bigger infinity than this infinity. Science cannot explain even the Big Bang without levels of infinity. But the average layperson, and it's okay if you don't understand, the average layperson doesn't understand it. So the scientific explanation of why this is a kind of a Pharisee question is never given to you. And so you're not given the information that you yourself know exists. And so it's kind of a fool's question because it's meant to trick you.
Yeah, if that rock was anywhere near Krakatoa, it would have landed 500 miles away.
That's right, that's right. And you give contradictory evidence to someone to whom you can explain away the contradictory evidence in a hope that in their lack of knowledge about that, and what is it, when politicians do that to you, what do you call them? Crooked.
We don't talk about politicians.
No, we won't. I'm saying at both ends of the spectrum. They didn't give me both the information on both sides. Well, are you surprised? Well, you know, even scientists and even, can I say archbishops do this? No, I don't know. But when someone ardently believes in something, they may not have a fault in try to convince you of that. Here is a way someone who wants to confuse a mathematician can talk. What's wrong with this problem? A equals B. A squared. A times A is equal to A times B, because A is equal to B. A squared minus B squared is what? I'll subtract B squared. So I have AB minus B squared. I can break that into A minus B times A plus B, which is B times A minus B. I'll divide by A minus B, and I have A plus B is B. Trust me, everything's fine up to this point, right? But B is equal to A, and A is equal to B, so that's 2B and that's B. 2B equals B, 2 equals 1. So, Mr. Mathematician Scientist, find the error. What's wrong with this problem?
You're one short of the Trinity.
What? No.
You're one short of the Trinity.
You're one short of the Trinity. Yeah, and you know what? Humor can diffuse the whole situation. Dawkins isn't as good. Dawkins really doesn't have that gift all the time. What did he say 3 times in that little movie clip? Why are you laughing? No, he does have humor, but he says, why are you laughing? That's not a funny point. This is not a funny point, but it is. It is a funny point because there's a fallacy in the argument. Right here, you divide by A minus B. Well, what's A minus B if A equals B? 0. What happens when you divide by 0?
A squared minus B squared is 0.
Right. So you can't divide by it. You cannot do what I did here. But to a person not versed with doing these calculations every day, I knew you didn't know that, and I can just sit here and say, come on, 2 equals 1. 2 equals 1, Mr. Scientist. This kind of discussion can be had in short movie clips. It can't be had in a full-blown, year-long discussion, okay? Do I mean the scientists are apt to tell you only part of the story? Maybe not intentionally. When we are principled, when we so believe in something, don't we oftentimes tell more of our side of the story than the other side of the story? So, quiet you two, it's both, okay? Where can we learn to keep the other ear open? And why might it be a good idea, okay? So, can we live in the both-and camp? Can we come just a little closer to the other side? And people say you don't understand someone until you've walked a mile in their moccasins, okay? Making room for God in science. Again, here's that idea that the design implies the existence of a designer. Gerald Schroeder talked about this. Francis Collins talked about this. Philip Johnson talked about this. Everything from evolution to relativity to the human genome has scientists on their side of the aisle explaining why this leaves plenty of room for God. So I think it would be interesting to talk about just 2 instances, and then I won't be able to finish what we have to talk about here, but we'll go as far as we can. The wedge strategy is a political and social action plan from a place called the Discovery Institute that is about the intelligent design movement. And it says they have an agenda whose ultimate goal is to defeat materialism. Now, see, again, strong word, defeat science, defeat materialism and naturalism, evolution, and reverse the stifling materialist world. And why is it stifling? Because it refuses to admit there's any room for God, okay? And replace it. Well, I don't know. Replace, supplant, those are strong words. Why can't we come more in harmony with a science consonant with Christian and theistic convictions, okay? So, Philip Johnson's at the strong end of telling science they have to admit that there's a need to admit an existence of God. Okay? God is the watchmaker. Okay? So this goes back as far as 1802 and William Paley. Okay? And it says here, there must have existed at some time, someplace or other, an artificer, a designer who formed the watch for the purpose which we find it actually to answer. This is a philosopher, but with very strong leanings that it had to be this way. I just think it's convincing that it can be that way. All right? Really interesting. Now, science, if you're really at the science end, you're going to have that, can God build a rock or create a rock so large that even God can't lift it? There's this contradiction. But science doesn't always want you to see that it embraces, well, they do. It's really out there for you to see that science also can embrace paradox. Democritus was one of the early philosophers that said everything is matter. Light is a solar atom. Okay? Aristotle said it's a disturbance in air. If it's an atom, it's a particle. If it's a disturbance in air, it's a wave, like sound. Light is just like another kind of disturbance in air. It needs an ether. We've learned since then that you don't need an ether. You can have light in space where there is no air to be disturbed. Okay? Descartes had the first treatise on wave nature. Science will be the first to tell you there is a thing called the particle-wave duality. Okay? In the particle-wave duality, there's the camp that says light is a particle, and there's a camp that says light is a wave. And then Chevy Chase comes in and says, quiet, you two, it's both. And science lives with that. Science absolutely embraces that apparent paradox. So let's go back here quick and look at, I'm going to show you a real quick clip of a little bit of that. So here is what science says about waves. It's called the two-slit experiment. You have two slits, and wave has a coherence, it has a frequency, and after the slits it has constructive and destructive interference. So you see patterns forming. They indicate and can be explained by the wave nature. This is a quantum mechanical effect. It says a particle is really a stream of probability. So in here it comes through the probability, and when it reaches the wall it's just one particle, one. And then another particle comes in. They could exist anywhere in probability, but then when it hits the wall it's where the probability is strongest. Then we send a whole bunch of these waves. These are particles written in quantum mechanics. Bang, 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 bang. And we watch where they end up, and lo and behold, they end up in precisely the same particles. Precisely the same patterns, like here. Quiet, you two. It's a floor wax and a dessert top. Now, what one may say then is, we don't really quite understand particles. They must be wave-like. We don't quite understand waves. Maybe they're more particle-like. We don't have an answer that keeps both camps happy. It's called a wave-particle duality. Both are right. Okay? This is one of the most interesting ones I find. And Gerald Schroeder is a Genesis scholar and a scientist. He's written 4 books on this subject. One is called The Science of God. He says there's an apparent paradox. We all know, he's speaking to scientists now, we all know about the twin paradox. And I tell the 2 twins in my confirmation class, Sid and Dom Evans, okay, Sid and Dom, we're going to separate you at 14. We're going to send Dom off to the planet Zumar at 7/10 the speed of light. Okay? And then she's going to come back. And she goes, you mean my sister's going to be gone? My sister's going to come back 14 years later. You'll be 28, but she'll be 25. Because when you travel at the speed of light, time passes
It doesn't.
more slowly. Okay?
Speed of light is a physical eternity.
Yes, at the speed of light,
Time doesn't exist.
well, time does, yeah, you'll find that if you actually go there, you have a 1 over infinity. So exactly, 1 over infinity in some people's book is 0. Doesn't exist. This doesn't exist. There's no longer a time to stretch. But what you have to realize there is you avoid both ends of the spectrum. The universe is made of matter, has mass, so it can't travel at the speed of light. That scientists accept that. But you can travel very close to the speed of light when there's less of the matter and things are very close to the Big Bang. Here, this might not look like, but it's the equation of a circle. It's just the equation of a circle. Plato said this is one of the Platonic shapes, right? Like a sphere was a Platonic solid. One of the basic solid elements of the whole universe. Just a circle, okay? Here's the clock rate. If you're traveling close to our speeds, the clock rate is just what you see. An hour takes an hour, okay? But if you're traveling very close to 1 is where the speed is the speed of light. When you're traveling very close to down here, things happen in much less than an hour. Okay, so what happens? Gerald Schroeder takes the best scientific facts he can find about what the speed of the Big Bang was. It's a number very close to the speed of light. So this number is very close to 1, but smaller than 1. You subtract a number very close to 1, like 0.99999 from 1, you get a really small number. 1, and take 1 hour at that speed. 1 hour at that speed over a very small number is a huge number. This is the time humans observe. This is the time you would observe on a clock at the Big Bang, if you're very close to, but not at the speed of light. So what Schroeder does is take what? He takes this number, the best number we have, 13.5 or 13.8 billion years, and he multiplies by this denominator. And he says, how long would it take at a speed very close to the speed of light, like the one we know occurred at the Big Bang? He takes scientists' best estimation of what the speed of the Big Bang was. We know the speed of light. We perform this little contraction. We put 13.8 billion years here. What happens there? A number very close to 140 hours. 140 hours is 5 days and 20 hours. Almost 6 24-hour days. I heard many pastors saying Christmas Eve that Jesus, I can hear Jesus laughing. I can hear him laughing because he's saying it's a dessert topping and a floor wax. It's 13.8 billion years and 6 24-hour days. And a lot of creationists will like to tell you, this can't, or scientists will like to tell you, the creationists will tell you, there aren't any dinosaurs in the Bible. There aren't any dinosaurs in the Bible because when you take the 13.5 billion years, Schroeder says, and you go back and find out the window where dinosaurs existed, it's between 10:01 and 10:03 on the Wednesday. How many of you, when you keep a journal of your vacation, keep it down to the 2-minute mark? How many of you don't have a picture of something that happened in those 2 minutes? Especially when you only have one chapter to tell the whole rest of eternity about it. This is a reasonable argument, he says. And I find that to be fascinating. Whoa. Something didn't happen. Oh my gosh.
Well, where time is concerned, you know about the cesium clock.
Oh, I know what's happening. What happened?
You know about the cesium clock.
Yes.
Yeah, Eb Schwartz and Alan Bradley developed the cesium clock. They had one on Earth, they put one on a satellite. Now the Earth is traveling 66,000 miles per hour through space,
right.
but the satellite's going 18,000 miles an hour around the Earth.
That's right.
And when they brought the satellite back, the two clocks were different. So they showed that time slows down with speed.
And it slows down even at the speed of a satellite. And people will say, this is not near the speed of light. Don makes an excellent point. You do this, you don't need for Dom to go to planet Zumar and come back 5 years younger. This is true on a clock that has to be very precise because I'm not going at the speed. The speed of light, you don't have to make this argument as I have to make that argument, I have to be extremely precise about what fraction of the speed of light I'm at. This is an excellent argument because what it tells you is another thing. People say, well, and then I don't quite believe in relativity. And you're not really allowed to say that at this point if you're a scientist because every experiment that's been done to test Einstein has proven to be correct. Mm-hmm. This experiment exactly satisfies the time dilation that Einstein predicted. And so if you don't believe that, then throw out your GPS. GPS all have to have this time delay in them, otherwise they tell you the wrong place to go, or they tell you inaccurately how long it's going to take to get there. And by so much so that you'll find the device to be utterly useless. Utterly, a strong word, but absolutely true. Absolutely true. If you don't believe any account of relativity, then you cannot for yourself purchase a GPS and believe where it tells you to go. Because that in fact says, for it to be correct, you have to have this kind of time correction. Very, very interesting thing. And luckily for us, I think I just wiped out 4 of my slides. So we'll skip them. I was going to skip this one anyway. Can you come to faith through science? This, I think, is a whole other topic. Some people have come to faith through science. You got people like Collins and Schroeder who started out in the religious camp, but they said had they started out in a scientific camp, they would not be able to remain in that camp and then deny the existence of a God. Here's Albert Einstein again, right? Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. He was a very, very huge mind in the middle. Collins, having perceived a glimmer of scientific truth, I find both a sense of satisfaction and a longing to understand even greater truths. So there comes, now here, if you really want to get hardcore, religion's actually favored by natural selection. Some people have proved it. So if you believe in the scientific camp, then there is an actuality toward civilizations that had a religion being more fit to survive. So, and of course, Dawkins will find a way to refute that. This is the other intelligent design argument that I find fascinating. How many people have heard of the golden ratio or section? The golden ratio is if you take a rectangle with certain dimensions, A by B, where A is larger than B, and then you cut out a square inside, take any square, take a square inside from this side, then this rectangle left over will be a golden section. Only if they're in that ratio where you have a ratio of A and B and add them together, and the ratio of A to A plus B is the same ratio as B is to A. You can figure that out, okay? That's algebra. And the number happens to be only if what? A plus B over A is 1.618 roughly. This is a fascinating number. I mean, when you come up with numbers in science and you say this belies the existence of a God, well then watch this. I mean, whenever you see patterns in mathematics, you're probably on to something scientific. And whenever you see a scientific explanation that has patterns, you might be on to something that's borderline religious. Here's a pattern, 1 over 1 plus, 1 over 1 plus, 1 over 1 plus, going on forever. And the more numbers you take, the closer to 1.618 you get. Okay? What does 1.618 give you? Well, first of all, advertising people will tell you that if you put an ad in the paper, you should put the borders of the ad in the ratio of the golden section. People's eyes will come to it much more naturally. You are not born a blank slate. Pine cones have a ratio of their arc to separation distance of 1.618. Plants all over the spectrum of biology have ratio of vein separation to leaf length 1.618. Cones and shells, naturally occurring, have ratios of volume to surface area 1.618. This is also 1 plus square root of 5 over 2 if you're a believer in pentagrams. Okay? Ratios of swirls to speed of rotation of galaxies 1.618. Now, Stephen Wolfram in Cambridge he went off on a 7-year hiatus. He's one of these people like Andrew Weil who proved Fermat's theorem. Went off into the desert for 7 years and rewrote a lot of scientific inquiry in terms of what are called cellular automata. Has anyone ever heard of the game of life on a computer screen? I was going to show it. But go Google the game of life, and it puts several particles in cells. And based on what the cell color is around you, your cell color either changes or doesn't change. Patterns emerge out of the game of life. Patterns emerge out of that game of life, and then Stephen Wolfram changed the rules of the game of life, and out came shells and leaves and veins and 1.618 over and over and over again. Okay? The golden section explains in the Nautilus the arc length to separation ratio of chambers. Same thing in a pine cone. This is emulated by the great architects who built and formed great precision items of design. The golden ratio is all over the place. Stephen Jobs says, I'm going to make an iPod whose length to width ratio is 1.618. When you curl your finger, the finger drawn around a curved finger is in a ratio of 1.618. The separation of the width of attractive looking lips to the distance of the chin is 1.618. People, when they put men in a room and asked them to say which women were attractive, invariably picked women whose hip to waist ratio was 1.618. Ideal, by the way, biologically for what? Reproductive carrying of children. So men should come impregnated with that? They don't have that number in their head, and you know we don't. Okay? Well, why is that number 1.618? The ratio of the curls in an ear, 1.618. The ratio of distance of eye to the width, and then the width of the eye relative to the distance, the ratios of the arm to the total length, and the digits to the arm, 1.618. All right? Dawkins would be choking. And he would say, well, science explains it all. Well, I don't understand how human fingers and reproduction and leaves and shells all fit in the same grand and glorious scheme. To me, this design begets a designer. Okay? Now, God is in the gap. Scientists love to talk about God is in the gaps. What is God? God is in the gap. Whatever you can't explain, right? Whatever is beyond your boggle threshold has to be God. And there's nothing beyond the boggle threshold of Richard Dawkins, and there's everything beyond the boggle threshold of maybe some of the rest of us. Einstein himself said, when some scientists say we don't need God because we have quantum mechanics. Everybody knows, well, not everybody, you might not know, Einstein's one of his greatest quotes, God does not play dice. Quantum mechanics is just probabilities. A lot of it's based on probabilities. God does not play dice, he said. So, to someone else, quantum mechanics fill the gap. Einstein said, this interpretation appears to me only to be a temporary way out. Science replaces the God that we put in the gaps with its own theory that can't explain everything or anything, because they need a placeholder because they do not want to admit that God can sit in that gap. Okay? The problem is your boggle threshold. The problem really is in the definition of what's a gap. Okay? If we admit that, then we can talk about whether we're actually filling a gap or not. Science says there's no gap right now, which let me give you for instance why I think that's interesting. Yeah.
Can man create life?
Did man create life?
Can man create life?
Can man create life?
There's a gap there.
What?
There's a gap.
There's a gap.
You say God does.
Well, some people will give you a scientific argument that leaves things out, and they may try to convince you of that. They may not necessarily believe it themselves. But what is the definition of a gap? If someone says quantum mechanics, Lawrence Krauss says quantum mechanics is how to get something out of nothing. No need for a God anymore. It's kind of a narrow interpretation of quantum mechanics, I'll admit to you, okay? Just because the probability seems to be zero, it's not probability zero, not 5 inches away. So the universe started 5 inches over instead of here. I'm fine with a God that said his language is quantum mechanics. You have to then, the gap is in the eye of the beholder. What you admit you don't know, and I just told someone beforehand, in my teaching philosophy, I always include the Korean, it's been attributed as a Korean proverb. He that knows he does not know is wise. He that does not know he does not know is foolish. Okay? Here's a for instance. In the famous scene in A Beautiful Mind, John Nash says in the bar scene, he tells everybody, oh, Adam Smith and the invisible hand. Adam Smith says, everybody do what's good for them. Adam Smith, incomplete, gentlemen, incomplete. And I tell the confirmation students, he never said Adam Smith was wrong. He said Adam Smith was simply incomplete. There's a gap that he hadn't filled in. And so he came up with the Nash equilibrium. Now, people want to talk about whether they believed him because he was in a mental institution, right? Interesting. Who dismantled the idea that the invisible hand was sufficient explanation with no gaps? Someone who himself, people didn't have a tendency to believe at the time. Who does God send as their messengers? Perfect people? It's almost always flawed people. Newton was the paradigm, all the way up until Einstein. Einstein had just been turned down to teach in a high school. He just lost a job to teach in a high school. Therefore, he was working as a patent clerk. And he published 2 papers that changed the entire 20th century physics. He shifted the paradigm. He said Newton is incomplete. Does not say what happens when we travel near the speed of light. And what happens near the speed of light is so different. You won't have GPS without admitting it. Okay? You won't have a lot of things without admitting it. This is the way things are, but it came from a patent clerk. A Swiss patent clerk who just been turned down for a high school teaching job. God picks as God's messengers those that people are not always apt to what? Think of as the perfect messenger, if you want to. I think of it that way. I think of it as these were not people at the stunning edge of their field who shifted the tectonic plates. Okay? So if you don't admit there's a gap somewhere, you're not going to fill it. Okay? So that's just kind of an interesting thing. Relativity calls Newton incomplete, but Einstein would be the first person to say, I don't build on this without Newton. Okay? So these are all other topics. I just want to leave you with this idea that science and faith debate from the early philosophers is something Pastor Matt talks about, and what questions versus purpose, or what for questions. There's a lot of other topics that can be discussed that we didn't even begin to talk about here, or I just touched on. Okay, so sorry it's so late, but if anybody has any comments, yeah.
Yeah, going back to evolution, the scientists believed in looking at I come to that fellow who said his great-great-grandfather of the 100th was a fish.
Yeah.
And it comes back to how scientists have found bits and pieces, and they determined that the coelacanth, which was millions of years old, came out of the ocean and started to walk around because of its physical nature.
Sure.
So that was their whole premise. All of a sudden, about 25 years ago, a guy off the islands of Greece catches a coelacanth. If that coelacanth didn't evolve, if coelacanths evolved, why didn't this one? And they couldn't explain that. So you've got to go back all over again and start your evolution theories all over again.
Oh, yeah, and then if you actually think of evolution as what is the best evolved fish, the shark hasn't changed almost at all in 90 million years. If you want to go do something interesting, Google the shark and evolution. The shark is about the same as the shark was 90 million years ago. It was the perfect predator then, and it's pretty much the same predator now. But if you have some of these fish, it might have been, again, what we describe in evolution as a genetic mutant, right? So one fish is born with a stubby leg, and he doesn't swim very well, but he crawls pretty well. So he goes outside because he's not going to survive if he stays in the ocean. And this fish then, eventually, several generations later, grows legs and becomes the top of the food chain, not the bottom of the food chain. So it's oftentimes, in evolutionary theory, the one who survives for reasons of being different from everybody else and not the same. So there's both ends of that spectrum. Absolutely fascinating, because what's good for one environment is not necessarily good for another. Yeah.
So you don't pit intelligent design and evolution?
I don't what?
You don't pit those two against each other? Do you see evolution as a reliable theory?
I see evolution as part of the answer. Yeah, it's part of the answer.
Okay.
I mean, if you set up an intricate set of rules about who survives and who doesn't, and then much like quantum mechanics, you don't say every fish with a stubby leg survives, but in general, if you average this over some ensemble average, and that's why Dawkins has a really good point. You cannot go back in the evolutionary record and say, this is where Homo sapiens began. It's over a broad time range. Evolution requires that you think over time ranges you're just not used to usually thinking in, and Stephen Jay Gould will say that. You cannot pinpoint the fish that came out and became the walking creature. You can talk about the probability and the fact that you believe in fact it happened, but you don't know. And then here, these observation points are the one skeleton, one fossil they were able to unearth, that from which they then developed a bigger picture. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have a scant set of data.
Knowledge ebbs and flows. People were extremely knowledgeable. In Egypt, they knew the Earth was round,
yes,
and they figured out how big it was.
Right.
In the Middle Ages, everybody said the Earth was flat.
Right.
So the knowledge ebbs, and then it just kind of disappears through the Dark Ages. And
there's observations that, given the lack of other facts, would lead you to conclude, even with scientific method, that the Earth is flat. Okay.
And wasn't everyone. It was Europe, Western by any means.
well, yeah, that's
China and the Aztecs had it figured out way before.
Someone someday is going to say the wave particle is incomplete, and they're going to tell you, like the elusive theory of everything, right? Hawkins and Dawkins now feel we have the theory of everything, so there's no gap for God to exist in. Only until the next Einstein comes along and says there was this huge gap, you just didn't see it.
That's right.
Right? You didn't know you didn't know.
Yeah. My statement relates to your gap slide, and that is that the argument between science and religion is either or for the last 100 years or so seems to revolve around the idea that as we get to know something scientifically, it no longer belongs to God. And a couple of years ago, I started questioning that idea. Why can't the things that we know scientifically be from God just as well as the things that we don't know? Who gets to control the answer to that question? And in fact, it ties in with my own personal beliefs about what journey God is asking humans to be on. And part of that journey might be a journey of knowing in lots of different ways, including knowing in a scientific way what God has created. Maybe our end purpose is God pulling us to be more like God or with God or part of God. And part of that is through our search of truth through science.
Yeah. And then some people say, well, why wouldn't God tell us that was God's language? And history is strewn with people who didn't tell us the language they were speaking, but once we learned to decipher it, maybe God wanted us as inquisitive creatures to decipher the language, to decipher Francis Collins says exactly that in that quote, and in his book, he feels like the human genome was like a Rosetta Stone that told us the language of God. It almost makes God bigger, not smaller.
Because what are we doing now in science? We've gone beyond knowing, we've started creating with that knowledge, co-creating with God things that didn't exist before.
Can humans create life?
Those issues.
Having to be responsible co-creators.
Well, you know what's interesting? One thing that has to do that is cloning. Cloning might not be, and maybe perhaps wasn't at all what you were referring to, but when they cloned a sheep from a 6-year-old sheep, that sheep was grown. But when the sheep was born, the argument was it 6 years old? In fact, it had a shortened life. And the older something you clone from, the shorter the life it will have. Because it has in its genes already something about its age. So it's really interesting. Did you create life, or did you just take an extension of life that already was? Can you start from nothing? And this argument just, to me, entirely philosophical. Nobody wins that argument in my mind. But some people feel
Really,
so
it was
with
an
it.
early argument of theologians, creation from nothing.
About what?
Creation from nothing is an early creation theology of the church. Which is way back from nothing. But I so appreciate
You know, I gotta say about myself, I have no trouble with creation from nothing. I do, because I believe in the smallness of myself, and the bigness of the possibility. But if you really believe in something, that's a real hard thing sometimes.
Right.
You just can't get to wrap your head around it. And that's why if you listen to his arguments very carefully, he almost always talks, and when he's talking to the Archbishop, he talks about starting at the simplest place. That's a cop-out. He didn't start from that. He started from the simplest one-celled creature, or the first thing that came after the Big Bang that was chemistry that formed life. This is all post-Big Bang. Unless you're willing to take a step to t equals 0 minus, you're not answering that question. I don't think he goes there because he can't answer it.
I mean, with cosmology. Get outside of nothing.
Okay.
They don't like
God,
that. They don't mind getting outside of
God
nothing.
is a reality that wasn't.
Well, where does that faith, your faith comes in there? And
Yes,
they were born and bred without faith. Thank you. That's nice. Yeah, thank you. Not exactly. I think the thing is, what turns me off is they use such strong language. It can't be.
No, I agree.
It just be on their experience of
Yeah, I agree. And like Beethoven, he came up with a new creative music. He was, he said, the more I discovered it was out there that you can do with music, the less I know about this.
Yeah. And that's the difference. Some people feel the more you know, the less there's less you're going to have to find out. And that's people that really get it to me are the ones that say, the more I know, the more I realize I don't know.
Yeah, we just
know the great ones that push
Breakfast is Saturday.
I'm coming, but I just want to know, I saw the kitchen. Are we cooking or bringing in? It's not done yet.
I'll go down there and find out. I thought
at what time? Because I don't want to be here at 5. We're not
yeah,
cooking.
be here at 6:15.
6:15, and if we're cooking, it's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's kosher, so put him in charge of the bacon.
Oh, that's not a problem.
I've seen the bacon. I haven't worked my way up to bacon.
He's got up to bacon.
I'll clean up. But
Well, I'm kosher, I'll do the bacon.
No, we're gonna have bacon. We're gonna have
I gotta tell you.
Hey, Vince, 6:30 probably be fine too. Because I was thinking about everything that's modern. Are the countertops in?
They're in, but it looks like they're covered with plastic, so I just didn't know if they were.
Yeah, because they thought they'd be in.
Were you here when we had the Hindu doctor? Was he Hindu or? And we were eating all of this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we had a doctor for health.
For health. Well, we have an industrial advisory board every year, and the professors I eat with don't eat bacon and eggs.
Yeah, exactly.
And so they go, we got these industrial guys want bacon and eggs. And so that's like the big breakfast we're all supposed to come for. I think it's funny.
I was saying, Pastor Marty asked her to bring the stuff here a couple days early, and she